Our speaker for lunch this afternoon is Karen Ard. Ms. Ard.
Good afternoon. I'm with Boustead Securities. I'm one of the investment bankers. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. Have been active in the cannabis space for the last 6 years for my firm. We continue to be more and more active. I can answer questions regarding how Boustead looks at cannabis and the broker-dealer and FINRA and the SEC, as well as other laws that will apply to the industry, if you'd like. But what I'd really like to do is introduce you, if you did not see Ben Lee earlier, Ben Lee, the CEO of the CIFT Group. Ben has been in the cannabis industry for a number of years, and their business is active in the cannabis industry. And I think that he can talk to you well about how they're approaching raising money. Keep in mind they are a non-touching or plant-touching company, and that's something that that we deal with a lot. We only deal with non-plant touching companies. So I'm going to introduce you to Ben, and then I'll introduce you to David after that. And David is a partner at KutaRock and the co-chairman of the KutaRock Hemp Committee. And KutaRock is truly a cannabis broker-dealer. I mean, that's not all they do, but I'm sure most of you know who KutaRock is. But they are very active in cannabis, and I highly recommend that anyone looking at going into cannabis investments or investment banking, that you deal with a firm such as KutaRock. I've run into a lot of attorneys in the last 6 years that say that they're cannabis attorneys and they don't keep up with the laws, the rules, the regulations, the states, the tribes, etc. And there's a lot to this little tiny infancy industry that's getting ready to really be explosive. So, Ben Lee.
Thank you, Karen. Can you all hear me? Yes? Perfect. Wonderful. Obviously, I am not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, so I'll let David speak all the legal issues. But what I will speak about today is really where is cannabis going, in the future. And I think, to really understand where we're going, we kind of have to look into the past. So the industry has just picked up in velocity significantly within the last 6 to 12 months. And, excuse me, the reason why that is because there's been such an influx of capital coming from individuals like yourselves. But if you look at the history of the industry, it really was run by individuals that were considered criminals for quite a number of years, until only recently where legalization really brought them above board. And some of these stories that I always tell are, whenever you get people like investment bankers in a room, they're wearing suits, right? And when they're trying to meet with cannabis industry veterans, typically they're wearing sandals, cargo shorts, and a tie-dye shirt, right? And it's funny because they really, really want to work together. But the challenge is they just don't speak the same language. And there's a lot of mistrust from the industry veterans because, again, they were looked upon as criminals for quite a number of years. So really what needs to happen from here on out is, excuse me, what needs to happen from here on out for the industry to be significantly more successful is for, obviously, those industry veterans to have more of an open mind, because if they don't have that open mind, then they can't really figure out some of the amazing technologies and systems that are already out there to apply them to the cannabis industry. Because what we've seen so far is these cultivators, there's, I don't know how many master growers we've met. Probably thousands. So when everyone says they're a master, basically no one's a master, right? And everyone always has the best weed. Everyone has the best whatever. I got the best nutrients. I got the best extraction. Everyone's the best at everything, right? But really, as the industry continues to evolve, what we're going to see, it's going to be very data-driven. Okay. If you have the best weed, it'll show in your test results. If you have the best CBD, it'll show in the test results, right? If you have the best delivery system, it'll show in the test results. And really what we want to do is to bring automation and systemization to the industry, because Right now, it's still a naturally derived product. So one of the things that we're working on is research to identify the specific cannabinoid profiles that work best for each individual indication or disease. So what that means is we'll soon have data and research on the ratio of CBD versus THC versus THCA versus CBN, CBG, so on and so forth, that works best for leukemia, brain tumors, epilepsy, so on and so forth. And once we're able to identify that, then we've already developed a technology called fractionation, or it's a separation technology. And it allows us to separate the different actives from one another. And the reason why that's important is because once we actually are able to identify the specific ratios that can attack, let's say, a brain tumor better or the best, then we can actually reformulate it to a consistent formula that we know is going to work 100% of the time, right? So it's really going to go in that direction. It's going to get significantly more technologically advanced, and we're really going to see a lot more, I guess you can say, systems that are coming from other industries that have been very prevalent in other industries for a long period, for long periods of time, such as just-in-time inventory, Six Sigma, enterprise resource planning, materials resource planning, so on and so forth. So, really, when we kind of look at the industry as where it is today, it's going to continue picking up velocity, I believe, and hopefully, we get these industry veterans that are going to be, significantly more open-minded to really implement the, the technologies and systems that, we're trying to, help them implement.
Okay. Now, David Bracht, you're going to stand up here, right? Is going to talk to us about some of the legal aspects of what's going on, the confusion with the Farm Act of 2018, which was released in November, is just overwhelming to the entire industry. And David will talk to you about what goes on with that and the Act of 2014.
Well, excuse me. Again, thanks to Karen and to NIBA for including me in this, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here today and talk about some of these issues, because it is really exciting. I couldn't agree with Ben more and Karen more about how this is really going to I think, truly explode. I'm going to go over some of the reasons why I think that is, but also that it is really complicated, and I think at times confusing. Sometimes because it's just confusing, and sometimes because of the history of where the industries come from. So first, a little bit about KutaRock. We are a national firm, but we're based and founded in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I'm from. Have a deep finance history, and in fact, in the early and still continuing today, spent a lot of time in the New York market working in financial products of all kinds. But really a full-service firm today with 18 offices across the country, and really from not everywhere, but from coast to coast, certainly in the East Coast and on the West Coast, and most predominantly in the center part of the country. As Karen said, this is a complicated issue because you've got some interplay of different laws, state and federal, and changes in those. And so we've got a group that really focuses on that. Today, I'm here primarily thinking about it from the hemp side, and I'm a co-chair of our hemp group, and I'll go in through some of the details of that. And that probably leads a little bit into both my background. I'm an ag guy. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska and started out in the banking industry, and in fact, through part of it representing some, or working with some of the banks I did, was in the investment industry on the retail side. Some 10 or 12 years into my banking career, I was in Washington, D.C., and working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and actually went to law school at night then. And so I've had a couple of instances where I've been within both federal and state government. Most recently, I was the Director of Energy for the state of Nebraska and a member of our Governor Ricketts' cabinet. And while that doesn't have a direct application here, it does kind of fit into the mindset that you have to be when you have regulations and a product that's going to be regulated going forward, and how you have to think about it. And we have a whole group of attorneys that think on that. First, an introductory question. And for most of you, certainly those of you in the audience that have looked at or been involved in the cannabis industry and thinking about hemp, you already know this. But it is a question that I always ask when they start talking about it. What's the difference between marijuana and hemp? And except for the most experienced eye, it's difficult to tell from just the plant. And in fact, you can't even always be sure from just the plant. That probably has more to do with how marijuana plants have been bred to reach their higher THC levels now. But under the law, the difference between industrial hemp and marijuana is the level of THC and the 0.3% that we've heard spoken about multiple times today. And I am going to go through a couple of these pretty quickly because they've been referenced by a number of the presenters that had companies that are working in the cannabis area and in the hemp area. But we have seen an expansion, first slowly and then really gaining some steam here, both in medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. This is a map, and by the way, my information is in the packet that you had, and if anyone wants to, I don't know if wants a copy of these slides, you can just send me an email, and I'd be happy to have you have those. So this is a map representation of kind of where the different states are at from a recreational and medical use. And you will note that Nebraska is one of the states that we're still grayed out. And in fact, we would be one of the recalcitrant 4 where even CBD oil is not a permitted product within the state of Nebraska right now. And that's just an example, I'll touch on it in a moment, where there's a little bit of this patchwork of product and laws, how that has to impact how you approach things. Just a little bit of a summary on where the recreational marijuana and the key aspect of that is typically within in the recreational, I think actually in all the recreational, there's limitations as to how much you can possess unless you're a licensed dispensary within that. And the key point, I'm not sure how to back up here, but I think that we all know is marijuana is still on the Controlled Substances Act, Schedule 1, so it's not permitted under federal law. Notwithstanding that, though, within the states that it's been sold at, we're seeing, a huge growth, which has been touched on multiple times today, both in the recreational and the medical, and the opportunity to grow even more. There we go. It's sleeping, there we go. And also in the international market, and just had visited at the table about, whereas today don't really have available to us the capital markets, or at least in the same way for product touching companies. But that's with the Canadian market now, certainly seeing an expansion of that as well, along with other countries. I want to underscore the point that Karen made, and that's certainly an important one within our firm as well, the distinction between touching and non-touching companies. And there's ethical issues that go into lawyers. Lawyers can be put into really difficult spots because of our ethical canon that's really adopted throughout the country as to what we're able to do, while at the same time it's not a legal federal product. And so that's something that we as lawyers have to work with. But there are many different areas where there's non-licensed, and so we do a lot of advice for those companies that are having to figure out how are they going to work with the cannabis industry, and that certainly falls into, for instance, banks. The crux of the problem, though, as I've referenced a couple times already, is that you have this distinction, and I think it's going to become, I've certainly have talked with people that say, well, it won't take very long and we're going to see it approved nationwide, and I think I could find people all across the continuum. And I may very well be wrong. I don't think it's going to be approved everywhere at the federal level in a matter of years. I think it is going to continue to take time. I can tell you on things that aren't as contentious as marijuana, maybe close to, as in energy, having just spent 4 years as a public official, it's difficult for public officials today because the public has a broad diversity, but frankly very polarized opinion of almost every issue. And I think the reality is, as much as there's in a growing part of the population, was pointed out earlier that 65, and if a couple more states go, it'll be above 80% of the population of the United States will be have at least medical marijuana available to it. The way our government structure is set up is those have tended to be on the coast and population centers, that when you look at our legislative process, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get that passed through Congress, and it's going to take time to do that, although we are seeing some changes with that. Let's make sure I'm still on. So what has the federal government been doing? Because this is actually, I think if you could certainly find some law enforcement, and I've spoken with law enforcement people who feel that it is an untenable situation, where on the one hand you have state law that are saying it's legal, and on the other hand you have federal law that says it isn't. And I could certainly find you some bankers who feel like it's a very difficult situation for them, because under banking law, if it's a federal, if those are proceeds from selling of a federally illegal product, it is considered money laundering, and so all of those funds would be subject to seizure by the government. A very difficult position for banks, and something I'll point on later. What has the federal government been doing, though, is there has been some applying increasingly discretion, sometimes it retracting, but increasingly discretion at the federal level. Where should that enforcement activity go? I've listed there 2 memos and then some guidance. FinCEN stands for the Financial Criminal Enforcement Network, and ways to try and make sure that the federal government and law enforcement is focusing their resources on the most important things. And in general, what you should take away from those is that the federal government is saying, we're not going to spend our time doing a lot of enforcement activities, and maybe none, in those states that have approved it as a legal use for legal use. So for instance, in Colorado. Although that isn't, again, without exception, certainly those federal agencies will look at things that would be outside of the federal or outside of the state approval, or if it was a feeling that it was gang-related, focused on underage, or any of those kind of things. There's actually, and that was there's a second Ogden memo that focused on 8 different characteristics to help law enforcement identify what should they be focusing on and what shouldn't they. I mentioned earlier the challenge with banking, and I'm sure any of us, whether you've worked in the industry or not, you've seen articles or you've seen television news programs talking about the cash-focused nature and the challenges that causes, because so many of the cannabis-related industries, they can't use a bank. A bank won't take their deposits, in essentially turning it into an all-cash. Because of those memos I'd mentioned, you are seeing some change to that. This is reporting as of fourth quarter of last year, showing about 500 institutions altogether that have accepted depository accounts for cannabis-related industries and customers. It still only is a minority, and it is still a challenge, but there is some movement within that. I'm going to zip through a couple of these because I want to focus on the most important here. There's been other other action and acts that have been passed or considered. As I said, the federal government had largely been adopting an approach of focusing not on states that had been that had legalized. I would say that at the early part of the Trump administration, when Attorney General Sessions was the Attorney General, that had retraced a little bit. It's yet to be seen whether that will continue. But overall, the industry has continued, and law enforcement has continued to kind of follow the path that they had. The most significant event, however, and I think will be a defining event, is the fact that the 2018 Farm Bill allows for and set up a regime to allow use of industrial hemp. Now, a lot of times, and I'll even use it somewhat here in my presentation, I'll say legalized, and you'll see that broadly. I think a more nuanced answer, however, would be is that it's really been decriminalized. Hemp was taken off of, and if it meets that 0.3% again, that's the definition, taken off of the Controlled Substances Act list. So it's no longer an illegal substance. But that doesn't mean that it can be transported widely and that there isn't anything. In many respects, think about it as alcohol, and that it's going to be subject to a lot of regulation. And whenever the federal government gets involved, at some point there'll be taxes on it, I'm sure, too. Just a real hit because of our time. Hemp has a long history. It's been used for a long time. And in fact, when I talk about agriculture, I like to talk about agriculture as the first high-tech industry from the time 5,000 and 6,000 years ago when the Egyptians learned how to irrigate, and then more recently, and today, extremely high technology. I think you could really say about cannabis and marijuana and hemp being the way it was referred to mostly then, as one of the first medical products, certainly thought to be a product that was really used in ancient times as a health benefit. Those legal developments, however, in the 20th century took an about face. There was one of the presentations talked about reefer madness. That led to some tax acts in the 30s to increase tax, and then 1970 when industrial hemp was included with marijuana and essentially criminalized. The 2014 Farm Bill then began the turn back, and under the 2014 Farm Bill, it established a regime where states could establish research programs. And we saw quite a few states get into that, and it really was the setup for the 2018 Farm Bill. But again, that's where we first saw that definition of not more than, or actually equal to or less than 0.3% THC. In a number of states, in fact, almost all of the states established some level of research program at that time. And that's really the starting point for where we're at. So the second thing that I think I would caution you is oftentimes, and you'll see me use it here, the 2014 Farm Bill expired. Well, what about all those programs then? Well, the 2018 Farm Bill, when it was passed in December of 2018, includes provisions that says those research programs continue on until the regulatory process for the 2018 Farm Bill is done. So you should think about those programs under 2014 Farm Bill will continue. And again, quite a number of states that have already done that. And if you want some more individuals on those, I have that information. Certainly Colorado and Kentucky are the two states that had the most active and most extensive hemp programs. There were others, but those are the leaders in the class. And Senate Majority Leader McConnell was a champion for the Farm Bill in 2018, and I think that's no surprise there too. I won't go all the way through it again because it's been touched before, but where the CBD oils and industrial hemp, and industrial hemp has a lot of, we think about it from, and I had a reference earlier, paper and rope, but the medicinal purposes are something that we have several clients within the firm that are looking at the antimicrobial benefits of textiles made from hemp and into the hospital and healthcare industry, having significant opportunities. So I think there will be a lot of opportunities there. Talking more specifically then, or a little more detail about the 2018 Farm Bill, it did several things. I already mentioned once. It took hemp off of the Controlled Substance Act. It also requires or directs the U.S. Department of Ag to do two things, or three things actually, to establish regulations that allow states to submit plans, and that also for those states that don't submit plans to allow an individual to request a license directly from the USDA for that, so long as the individual state that that producer is in there isn't any law making it illegal in that state. So in other words, if your state says it's still industrial hemp is illegal, it wouldn't be allowed. Or in the case of, say, Nebraska, if we don't change our law about CBD oil, notwithstanding what is in the Farm Bill, the state law would still trump that. But if the state law is silent, then, even if we don't pass a plan, then the USDA will have basically a national plan that producer can contact there. Part of that plan is going to include a number of things as to how to, a whole set of requirements, controlling how do you test it, what do you do with product that isn't tested or doesn't meet the test requirements, how do you dispose of that, what's your record keeping, all of those kinds of things. And in many respects, I think that USDA, and based on the initial USDA listening session that I listened to just 2 weeks ago, I'm anticipating they're going to follow some of those things that the active states had done in the past. Two key points that I'm going to leave you with is under the Farm Bill really establishes a series of how can I continue to be in good standing? And it's going to allow what it refers to as negligent violations, where you've had some product that exceeded the 0.3%, and you're going to have some opportunity to correct that. But at some point, if you have multiple of those, in fact, any 3 within a 5-year period, then that would force you to become out of that. And both the state plans and the federal plan is going to have to follow that. Then there's successively increasing more penalties as you get worse from that. So to kind of sum this up and then leave one last, I think, important slide is you will hear that the 2014 Farm Bill is expired, but those research programs that were set up under the 2014 Farm Bill will continue. And that continuation, that extension, will continue until 12 months after the USDA regulations have been posted. Under the regulations, again, there's going to be a federal plan, and states will be able to submit individual state plans. Now, the Farm Bill does say that USDA will respond within 60 days of receiving that state plan, but the agency has said, we don't even know what we would do with that, and so that provision won't be fully in effect until they've issued regulations. And it's unlikely they would find a court that wouldn't follow that same viewpoint. And then finally, just to reinforce, if a state doesn't issue a individual plan or publish a plan, then that individual could go to the USDA so long as their state doesn't prevent that. The last thing, and is really important, and we've already seen some ramifications of this, is people either not seeking legal advice at all or not getting good legal advice said, hey, I heard that President Trump signed the Farm Bill, and now hemp is legal. And put a bunch of hemp in a truck and send it from one state to another, unfortunately crossing a number of states where it was illegal. And so there's actually, and I feel sorry for the 2 truckers, you've got truckers that are, 2 of them, no longer in jail, but actually still at some legal peril. I'm hoping that the court system will kind of recognize what the intent there was. We had one even in Nebraska where there was a shipment of seeds, stopped in Nebraska. Again, a dog, a trained dog is able to detect if there is that. It was a certified seed, and ultimately the thing that kept that particular, and it was the chief scientist for the company, which would have been a problem for him from being in jail, is we were able to determine they had a USDA experimental seed license, and that basically gave them the opt-out or enough for law enforcement to say we're not going to worry about it. So that's an important thing when you're talking to companies, or if you're involved in a company, it is really important to wait until these regulations go. I didn't say it, I should have. What USDA has said is they're expecting to issue these regulations at the end of this year, focused on the 2020 crop. And so that's probably when we would anticipate those regulations to happen. Yep. So any questions right there? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. 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 So, you bet. I actually have a slide that has that SAR chart. And the answer to that question is it really comes down to procedures and then trying to work with your regulators. But it's a training one. And I think that's going to be the case on cannabis and hemp overall. And so that's the approach that we've been using with our clients thus far. I will say some banks, that's not enough yet because they feel like there's a risk. You know, I'm somewhat familiar with that, but probably not enough that I can write off. So the question is some of the provisions that are on the UN cap on shipment, import-export of hemp, and how that's addressed in the Farm Bill. Perhaps you and I can exchange cards and I can follow up with that.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you.